Richard Boone's son says that the stories regarding his father's private life are true. Richard Boone's full name is Richard Allen Boone. He was born on June, Los Angeles, California. On the 18th of 1917, Boone was the grandson of the famous frontiersman Daniel Boone. This family history appeared almost like a sign of the tough authority he would later show on television. But his route to acting wasn't quick or normal. Boone went to Stanford University, where he studied drama and grew to love literature, philosophy, and the arts. Interests that would eventually give his performances a smart, cerebral aspect before Hollywood ever got him. Boone was a US Navy navigator during World War II, flying perilous combat missions in the Pacific region. The event changed the way he saw the world and gave his later performances a sense of realism, tiredness, and moral weight that acting school could never teach him. Boone didn't just play tough guys like a lot of other actors. He knew them. Boone went back to acting after the war, this time with more seriousness. He studied at the Actors Studio with the famous Lee Strasberg. There, he honed a disciplined, emotionally based style to performance that distinguished him from several colleagues. In the early days of his career, he played a lot of different characters in movies and TV shows, usually as a villain, soldier, or tough authority figure. He was almost 6 feet tall and had a deep, booming voice that made him stand out even in little parts. In 1957, Boone's career hit its peak when he was cast as Paladin in Havigan Will Travel. Paladin was not like the simple gunslingers in old westerns. He was a refined, well-educated mercenary who cited Shakespeare, charged a lot of money, and followed his own set of rules. Paladin was a philosopher and a gunfighter. He wore black and stayed at the beautiful Carlton Hotel in San Francisco. He preferred reason to bloodshed, but he never backed down from it when justice called for it. Boone's performance made the show far more complex than other shows in its category. He pushed for excellent scripts, complicated moral issues, and smart dialogue, which often led to disagreements with network executives who thought the viewers didn't want anything too deep. Havigan Will Travel became one of the most highly acclaimed westerns of its time because of him. It appealed to both adults and children and showed that Boone was an honest artist. Boone kept taking on tough roles after the show that showed off his range and how serious he was as an actor. He was in movies with John Wayne, like Big Jake 1971 and The Kremlin Letter 1970, and he was in The Tall T 1957. Where he played a scary outlaw and showed how good he was at conveying knowledge and threat without being too much. He was just as good at being a hero as he was at being a villain, and he often blurred the line between the two. In the 1970s, Boone had a fresh hit on TV with Heck Ramsey, where he played a former gunfighter who became a detective with a forensic mind, once again bringing brains and evolution to a position in a genre. Boone turned what could have been a typical character into a thinking, forward-looking one, much like he did with Paladin. This shows how committed he has always been to playing guys who developed, questioned, and changed. Richard Boone continued to show the depth, authority, and unmistakable presence that had made him one of Hollywood's most powerful actors in the last interesting chapter of his movie career. He acted in The Great Niagara in 1974 and Against a Crooked Sky in 1975. These were both ventures that helped him improve the rough, world-weary characters he played so well. Around this time, Boone worked with John Wayne for the third time on Wayne's last and very important movie, The Shootist 1976. The partnership was very moving. Boone, who was sick, stood next to the old Duke in a drama that dealt with death, legacy, and the end of an era in classic American cinema. Boone still worked in movies, but he also went back to the basics of his art. He went back to New York City and the local playhouse in the middle of the 1970s. This was the famous school where he had trained as a young actor. Boone became a teacher there, sharing decades of hard-earned knowledge with a new group of artists. People remarked that he was both intimidating and motivating in the classroom. He had worked on stage and screen for most of his life and had a deep regard for the art of acting. Boone's later films showed how versatile he was and how popular he still is. He starred in God's Gun 1976 with a great cast that includes Leif Garrett, Lee Van Cleef, and Jack Palance. The movie had a gritty spaghetti western feel to it. He went on to star in the fantasy adventure movie The Last Dinosaur 1977 and the sophisticated adaptation of The Big Sleep 1978. These roles helped solidify his image as an actor who could adapt to new movie trends without losing his unique edge. One of Boone's most remarkable late career works was not in live action but in voice acting. In 1977, he gave the dragon fog in the animated version of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit a deep, scary, and distinctive voice. His acting made the famous monster seem smart, arrogant, and dangerous, which has been a classic for fantasy enthusiasts for generations. Winter Kills 1979 and The Bushido Blade 1979 were Boone's last movies that ended his career with a subdued passion, even as his health got worse. His performances still possessed the power and emotional weight that had marked his work for decades. These last roles were an appropriate way to say goodbye. They marked the conclusion of an amazing career and left behind a legacy of fascinating characters, strong stories, and lasting impact on American film and television history. Richard Boone's life was as complicated and full of events as the tough characters he played on screen. It was full of love, change, and strong familial ties. He got married 3 times in his life. Each marriage was a new chapter in his lengthy and changing journey. When Boone was still a young man trying to figure out his place in the world, he married Jane Hopper for the first time in 1937. The marriage only lasted until 1940, but it happened during his formative years. A time when he was both ambitious and unsure of himself. Boone fell in love again with Mimi Kelly about 10 years later. Their marriage from 1949 to 1950 was short but important. It came at a time when Boone was getting better at his art and getting closer to the career that would define him. These early marriages, though they didn't last long, were part of the real-life tale of the tough guy on screen who was learning, maturing, and looking for stability in his personal and professional life. In 1951, Boone married Claire Malone, the woman who would be his wife for the rest of his life. This was the stability he had been waiting for. Their marriage lasted for more than 30 years when Boone died. It was the center of his private life. Boone developed a long family life with Malone that was far different from the aggressive, morally complicated characters he regularly played on TV and in movies. They had a son named Peter Boone, who for a short time followed in his father's footsteps. Peter was a kid actor on Have Gun Will Travel, the famous Western show that made Richard Boone one of the most powerful leading men on TV. These engagements gave people a rare look at Boone as a parent, sharing his world with his child and bridging the gap between his professional successes and his personal life. For years, Richard Boone worked hard to make himself look strong on screen, a dominating figure with a gruff voice and piercing stare that showed authority, toughness, and moral complexity. But behind the famous performances and public praise was a very private battle that Boone passionately protected for most of his life. Years later, when his son told the truth about Boone's concealed pain, it became clear what had been going on. His son said that the tales that had been going around discreetly among friends and co-workers for a long time were not exaggerations, but pieces of a much bigger, sadder truth. Richard Boone's son said that his father lived a secret life that was full of chronic agony, physical deterioration, and emotional pain caused by a terrible disease that followed him for years. Boone kept working and acting like he was strong and unbreakable, but disease was taking over his private life more and more. The illness slowly took away his strength and comfort, making every day a battle against pain. People who were close to him saw how he celebrated his toughness, but in reality he was fighting a never-ending conflict inside himself that he didn't let anyone see. Boone's habits made his physical pain worse, and he had a hard time justifying or giving them up. His son said that Boone had been drinking and smoking heavily for many years, and these habits grew very strong well before the last few months of his life. These were not just things he did for fun. They were long-term addictions that made his pain worse and better. In the last month of his life, the harm done by years of drinking and smoking became too much to ignore. This sped up his decline and made the tragedy of his last days much worse. Boone's honesty about not being able to control his addiction, at least with his family, was probably the most upsetting thing. Boone told his son straight that he was an alcoholic in one really honest moment, without trying to make it sound better or make excuses. He said, "I drank until my throat burned, and it made me unable to drink anymore." This showed that he was not brave but desperate. The statement showed that the man knew he was destroying himself. Yet he couldn't stop it. Boone did not deny that he was hurting himself and the people who loved him the most. "I know it's bad for me, but I can't help myself," Boone said, his comments showing how well he understood how bad things were for him. "Even with the help of my loved ones, I know something is wrong with me doing it." These comments show how hard he is fighting. not just with booze, but also with the feeling of being shattered inside that addiction often brings. Even though his family was worried, begged, and supported him, Boone felt stuck in a cycle he couldn't totally escape or give into. Richard Boone is not only a famous actor, but also a really human person who is flawed, hurting, and achingly honest when he is vulnerable. As his son reveals, his story isn't one of scandal, it's one of silent sadness. A man who was loved by millions but kept his anguish to himself. By learning about Boone's personal life, people are encouraged to look behind the legend and see the toll that sickness and addiction took on him at a time when these issues were rarely talked about. Richard Boone's last chapter was defined by calm dignity, physical pain, and a feeling of closure that showed how complicated his life was both on and off the screen. He died on January 10, 1981, at the age of 63 in his home in St. Augustine, Florida. This ended the life of one of television's most powerful and smart leading men. Boone had been fighting throat cancer when he died. This was especially hard for an actor whose voice was one of his most potent tools. Boone's deep, powerful, and commanding voice was a big part of his movie image, especially in Havigan Will Travel, where his thoughtful discourse and philosophical monologues raised the Western genre above just gunplay. The sickness slowly took away that important part of him, making it hard and difficult to talk. The loss hit him hard because he used to be able to easily and confidently command sound stages. Many people thought that Boone's cancer got worse because he smoked a lot of cigarettes for many years. This was a normal practice in Hollywood at the time, and he never publicly denied it. Boone's professional and social life both included smoking, which was a part of the culture of the industry. Long work days, stress, and drinking with friends were common. As his health got worse, the effects of those years became too big to ignore. The disease kept getting worse, and even though Boone got medical care, his condition got worse, leading to major problems that eventually killed him. Boone decided to stay at home instead of going to the hospital in his last months. He spent his last days in St. Augustine, a historic coastal community far from the bright lights of Hollywood, where he could be at peace and quiet. Florida gave him a quieter life. One where he could think about his family, his profession, and his life without the entertainment world always getting in the way. People who knew him subsequently said that he was physically frail but still cognitively alert, reflective, and fully aware that his time was running out.